There were 8 major techniques or criteria that were used to control people's minds and get them to change. And it's really interesting to see how these 8 criteria can be used to take a look at how cults control and manipulate their own members. And what I'll do is I'll go through each one so that you get a better idea of what it is as Lifton defined it, and I'll see what I can do about applying it to how cults use it, and specifically how the cult I was in, the Jehovah's Witnesses, use it. You know, a lot of groups will use 1 or 2 of these on occasion, of the 8 criteria. Unfortunately, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses use all 8, and they use them all the time. So that people do not have free will. 2 of the things that are required for consent. The first is that a person must know, have full information of what is involved in the cult. And the second is that they have to have the real freedom to say yes and no. And the reality is most cults do not fully disclose all of the rules to prospective members. They wouldn't say to somebody, well, if you join Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll never be able to celebrate holidays again, and if a family member leaves the group, you'll never be able to talk to them again. The fact that there isn't that full disclosure, a lot of people are basically manipulated into thinking they're joining something different than what they actually get. And the other thing is, with all of the guilt and the rules and the idea that all of this information comes from God, then the person is not really free to say yes or no. The witnesses will say they're not a cult, but any cult will say they're not a cult. And one of the things that a lot of groups say is, well, we're not a cult because we don't follow people around, you know, people are free to come and go as they please. They've got jobs, they've got lives, they live in their own homes. But the very subtle nature of mind control is that they don't need somebody following you around to monitor whether you're following the rules or not. They teach you to monitor your own behavior and your own thoughts. So you become afraid of doing things because somebody else might see you, but also afraid of your own conscience. And then the only way to relieve that guilt is to tell somebody. And the people that you often tell are the elders and the leaders of the cult, or the elders in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses. So your membership is no longer about love of God or a love of doing what is right. It becomes about fear of breaking rules. They lose their individuality, but they also lose their ability to think. You don't say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You just accept that that's the way of things. I'd say about 80–90% of my friends had been abused before they became witnesses. And this sets up a particular dynamic for the love bombing. People who have been abused and, you know, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, people who come out of cults experience what has been defined as post-cult trauma syndrome, which is basically the same thing, with a spirituality element. And this is why women stay in abusive relationships. It's also why people stay in abusive cults, because there's this constant kind of dangling the carrot that if you're good enough, you will get everything that you've been promised. And there's nobody to talk to. And even if you go for therapy, very few people are going to understand it. I went to a therapist, I was able to talk to her, but I knew it was way over her head. She didn't have a clue what I was talking about. Really heavy-duty fears planted in there. I know as an adult I didn't allow myself to think about those issues. But, you know, here I am reading it to my children. Despite the denials of the organization that abuse doesn't exist within the organization, I'd say it's probably rampant because, you know, who do you go to if you're, you know, it's an old boys gang, even, you know, within the congregations. They're only going to report what doesn't reflect badly on the organization. Let's face it, an elder is, or any brother in the congregation is abusing his family, it's not going to appear too great if it hits the media. My one-time mistake, which turned out to be a rape, wound up being, reason for disfellowshipping. And his 15 years, there's not even a note in his files about it. And this whole issue of blood guilt that they instill in people, that if a wife does not fulfill her sexual obligation to her husband, if he commits adultery, then she's responsible. And people would say, oh, you have such a wonderful family. When I get married, I want a family just like yours. And I would want to be sick, but it's like, oh, well, thank you very much. And again, that pretense and not showing people what was really inside of me, because that would have been totally inappropriate, not allowed, to show that I was having problems, severe problems. I think it's really important for people to get counseling. And sadly, it's really hard to find. Very, very few people understand the dynamics of abuse, never mind the dynamics of spiritual abuse. There needs to be a crossover there, where the two, you can begin to see the psychological impact of something that comes from religion. Spiritual abuse can be emotional, physical, psychological, sexual. It can be any of those, but there's an added element of using a higher power, higher authority, God, or however that is defined by a group, whether it's the individual saying, I am God, or, like the witnesses, this governing body is the mediator between people and God. So there's this added element of spirituality or higher power that is used to control and manipulate people. And in doing so, it robs people ultimately of their spirituality. Because if somebody's controlling it, then you don't have your spirituality anymore. Somebody